Cool. Yeah, thanks for reminding me, Tommy. Um, awesome. So let's start the event. So thanks everyone for coming to our event. Um, this is welcome to our first installment of the CS Professional Speaker Series. This is a monthly thing that we're trying out. So it's essentially the idea is to invite different professions from different aspects of CS to talk on a variety of topics. So from like career stuff to ethics to other topics. It's something that we're trying out this semester. Um, so I would like to extend my welcome to Vinesh Kannan. He's an IIT alum, graduated in 2019 in computer science. He used to lead ACM and has played a big part in what ACM is today, and even in what I am today. And Vinesh will be talking on today. Vinesh will be discussing different ethical experiences that he's had while working in the industry. From starting his own startup to working at smaller companies like Mimmer to bigger companies like Google. He's had a lot of experience, and yeah, I'm very interested in hearing his experience. So without further ado, Vinesh, I'd like to give you the stage.
Thanks, Prince, and thanks everyone else for coming. As Prince said, until recently, I was a software engineer at Google. I left Google because of their recent mistreatment and firing of Dr. Timnit Gebru and April Curley. Dr. Gebru was the co-lead of the ethical artificial intelligence team at Google, and April Curley was the recruiter who designed Google's program for hiring from historically Black colleges and universities. And when I came to Google, both of those were areas that I wanted to do work in because of my experiences with ethical challenges at lots of other organizations. There's lots of interesting technical and business topics that I would love to share about with ACM and with other IIT students, but the topic of ethics and tech is one of those areas that comes before all of that. So I thought I would share some sort of previously private stories from past organizations that I've been part of, and to mainly focus on the questions that you have. I saw in the the advertising for this event that you had designed this like 4 square diamond, and I was telling Prince that it kind of looks like a hazardous material sheet from like a chemical, which is probably fair because some of the organizations that we'll talk about could be considered hazardous. But before I get into it, I wanted to give a little bit of background about ethics very briefly. You may have heard the words ethics and morals. Ethics is how a community or a society decides what is good and what is evil. And then morals are how an individual describes it. So we're talking about ethics, and I'll share stories of my sort of personal morals that will hopefully help you reflect on yours and the morals of the organizations that you are part of or want to be part of. A lot of these topics are hotly debated. And so some people ask that you not get political, but ethics is inherently political because it affects the lives of different groups who we need to understand and give appropriate power and resources to. And other people are nervous about the term activism, but activism is the way that we take our ethics and turn them into action. And so you'll see some of those in the examples that I give. My goal with this conversation is to share about my personal experiences and to give you some more resources at the end, but I hope that you won't feel overwhelmed. A lot of these topics are overwhelming, very challenging, and even traumatic. So if at any time you need to, turn off or excuse yourself, that won't be rude to me at all. And I'll try to focus on the ways that when we have limited energy and limited bandwidth, what can we do about ethical challenges in the tech industry? A really brief overview: in academic study of ethics in Western countries, there's generally 3 different ways of looking at ethics. And maybe this will help you kind of categorize some of the examples I'm going to give. A lot of people in tech talk about utilitarianism, which is about how can we create the most good for the most people. The flip side of that is how do we reduce harm to any people. Then there's a field called deontology, which is all about rights and responsibilities. And that can be important in tech because if you work as an engineer or a data scientist or a designer, you might not be sure which ethical problems are your responsibility. And then there's an area called virtue ethics, which is about acting based on your values. Often, being tech employees or just members of society, we're always a little bit ethically compromised. We can't always do what our morals or our principles would want us to do because of lack of information or lack of resources. And so virtue ethics is about trying to strike that balance and continue to live by your values, even if you're in a system that doesn't always share those values. Ethics is a huge component of technology, and I'll try to give three quick, very famous examples to underpin why it's so important that we think and talk about these issues. One very famous example are recent moratoriums being put on facial recognition. And this is actually something that Dr. Jabru, before Google and while she was at Google, has been a researcher and an advocate for. She sponsored the research that Joy Buolamwini and Deb Raji did on a study called Gender Shades, which showed that facial recognition systems deployed by industry and government are worse at recognizing women and transgender people than males, and are worse at identifying dark-skinned people than light-skinned people. And they also underscored how facial recognition systems, even when they're working as intended, can create massive harm, whether it's to activists, people that have been wrongly accused of crimes, or even like renters that live in a property where they're being monitored. Because of both their research and their advocacy, many cities and government organizations have put public moratoriums that will forbid government from using facial recognition. And many companies have put in moratoriums freezing their sale of their facial recognition projects. These kind of actions were unprecedented even just a year ago. And it shows you how quickly and how urgently a lot of these problems, especially those that are tied into artificial intelligence, can come to the forefront. And even though there are very high profile ethical discussions about when are we allowed to have privacy or who is being targeted with facial recognition systems and what it means to be identified by one of these systems, interwoven into all of those are the political and the financial discussions of companies and governments that use this technology. Another example that people may have heard of or may not have heard of is about how IBM technology was used in the Holocaust, as well as in other tumultuous times in history, like the internment of Japanese Americans in the US. This has been a cause of a lot of controversy. IBM as a company has acknowledged the way that its technology was used by the Nazi regime in Germany and has even donated many millions of dollars to Holocaust remembrance and recovery programs, but has never legally accepted responsibility for the role. And this example, more than any others, effectively captures an ethical question that is also a political and an economic question, which is how responsible are we for the way our technology is used, especially in ways that we didn't intend? And this debate continues to rage on, even in some of the organizations that I'm part of. And we'll talk about some of the modern manifestations of that, such as how Microsoft and Google's technology is being used by immigration and customs enforcement at the border as part of operations that are involved in human rights abuses. Or on a smaller scale, how a company that I used to work for would debate whether its technology should be used by customers that don't share our values. And a third example is how another recent example, you might have heard of Rebecca Jones, who was a data scientist who worked for the state of Florida. And she was responsible for maintaining the dashboard that shows the number of COVID cases across Florida. And she blew the whistle on unethical behavior in her department when the Florida Department of Public Health asked her to manipulate the COVID numbers so that it would look like the virus was spreading less rapidly. And instead of doing that, she took the data from the city and published the real numbers on her own website. Her house was raided a few weeks ago, and she is currently on trial to go to prison, awaiting bail. And it's another classic example that shows how even in the technology community, it's not just companies, but also governments and nonprofits and other organizations that face these ethical challenges. And this one is particularly interesting because there are ethicists who debate both sides. Some ethicists say that what Rebecca Jones did was wrong because she stole and published data, and we have no reason to trust that her data is correct. And others are worried about the precedent set by a government organization asking its data scientists to manipulate this sort of data. Because ethical debates are so controversial and so related to political and financial power, there unfortunately will always be ethicists who are on one side or the other. And my goal in saying this is not to say that both sides are equally valuable. In this case, it's quite clear to me, based on the details of the case, that Rebecca Jones was the one who acted ethically, and it is the government of the Florida state that is acting unethically. And so, in your career and as you read about things in society, you'll have to make these judgments and research for yourself, because it's very easy for ethics to get lost in debate between two sides that don't share the same goals as far as what they want to see come out of it. If you're having a hard time extending these examples to companies that you might have worked for before or that you admire and want to work for one day, these are some questions that I've written down for you. Think about who is harmed by your organization's work. Think about what risks might be overlooked that no one else is responsible for. Think about what power your organization has and how it might abuse it or use it in a way that you don't think is good. And then if you see your company or people at your company doing things that feel dubious, that feel wrong, but you're not quite sure why, dig into how they're rationalized. And by rationalized, I mean, what explanations do people give for why that behavior is okay? And if no explanation is given, it might be up to you to ask in the first place. So before we get into some of the private stories, I wanted to pause here and take any questions that you have about what we've talked about so far. All right, if there are no questions, then I will move on. So these are four organizations that I've worked for in the past. And as I noted on the first slide, none of what I'm going to tell you is reflective of those organizations' view. These are my personal stories that I'm sharing with other IAT students and community members. This is the one that Prince asked me to talk about, so we'll start with this. For the last year and a half, I worked as a software engineer at Google. It was officially my first job after graduating college, but it wasn't the first time that I was working in tech. And for me, working at Google was a dream in a lot of ways. Obviously, it's a really recognized company. I learned a lot through the role, and it has dramatically improved my confidence as an engineer. But there were many times throughout being at Google that I realized that the organization did not act according to my values and did not even act according to the values that it held for itself. I quit the company in January because of the firing of Dr. Jabru, our head of ethical AI, and April Curley, a recruiter who led Google's recruiting from historically Black colleges and universities. And there's so much that I can say about how they were mistreated and how Google's actions in handling them diverged from what the company and its leaders consistently tell employees are its values. But I'll give a succinct description of what happened, and then I'll explain the debate and the decision for me to leave because of it. So first of all, Dr. Jabru has been working as an ethical researcher and the manager of a team focused on ethical AI at Google. I mentioned some of her achievements as far as facial recognition, discovering ethical technological risks, and leading activism to ensure that governments and technology address those issues. At Google, she has done this in a number of ways, some public, some private. But basically, her team works with different product teams at Google to identify the ethical risks in the machine learning models that they use and come up with mitigation strategies. One example was the Celebrity Faces project. Google provides an API that will let you recognize a certain celebrity from photos of them. And this is a feature that comes with a lot of ethical risks. It can be used for harassment. It can be used to create things like revenge porn, and it can be used to create to try and train models that generate imposter images of celebrities. Some of the mitigations that Google took up in order to launch this feature as safely as they could was to first of all get opt-in from celebrities to participate. Sometimes even academic researchers collect images of celebrities because they're in the public domain or they're considered public figures. But Google needed to go one step further, especially because it was going to profit off of this tool. Another was that this would only provide facial recognition of celebrities that are in the data set, not any sort of generation. And the last key measure was to make sure that the access to this tool was only provisioned to valid partners. So Google would have to vet every single person that wanted to use this API. And if the access to the API were to fall into the hands of someone abusing the technology, then Google would hold responsible the person whose access they got it from. At many technology companies, these sorts of mitigations are not done because the company worries it will slow the launch of the product to market, it will restrict future revenue opportunities, or entangle them in legal problems. But Dr. Jabru's team was persistent in researching, working with the company to implement these, and then showing how they lead to successful product implementations and reducing the fallout of bad technology products. So that's one example of her work. And the conflict that led to Google firing her recently was that she and a number of collaborators from outside the university had published a paper about the risks of large language models. Some of the risks that they focused on were the environmental impact, emissions from training these massive models that have billions, hundreds of billions of parameters and are much larger than the models that you might have worked with at an ACM workshop or a hackathon or even a class, as well as how these models can encode and then amplify racist, sexist, ableist language from their training sets. The paper went through Google's review process, which is designed to screen for any leak of private IP, and it had been accepted to a conference, subject to that conference's approval process and peer review. But then after it had been submitted, Google asked that Dr. Jabru and her collaborators reword the paper so that it highlighted ways that Google was working to improve the emissions problem and to identify racist and sexist biases in data sets. This led to a standoff between Dr. Jabru and Google's HR team. And as a result of the HR team not being willing to discuss these decisions, Dr. Jabru threatened to resign if they couldn't meet them. And instead of discussing this, Google claimed to accept the resignation that she hadn't officially given. And on paper, the company actually terminated her for a different reason, which was while this discussion was going on, Dr. Jabru emailed a mailing list, which is for women and allies at Google Brain, explaining what was going on and why this sort of thing is a dangerous precedent for AI research and inclusive environments at the company. And so sending that email was what Google claimed was not appropriate behavior for a manager and was their reason for terminating her. This was really troubling to me because one of the reasons that I wanted to come to Google was because I thought the company was leading in the space of ethical AI. And the consistently strong work that I had seen from Dr. Jabru and her team was something that made me want to come to Google in the first place. And I had used her research with my team. I worked in Google Shopping, separate from Google Research. And we constantly used the things that the ethical AI team was producing to influence our own work. And the way in which she was fired over a petty disagreement that also amounts to effectively censoring the research that she and other external collaborators who don't even work at Google were working on, is very puzzling to a lot of people externally. And I guess the best way that it could be explained, based on what people internal to Google have seen and said, is that the organization has labeled Dr. Jabru as an agitator, as someone whose ethical work gets in the way of what other teams want to do. And that's always like an inherent tension in trying to do ethical work in technology. And what I believe we need technology companies to do is to actually provide protections and support to the employees that are doing this sort of work. And what Google chose to do instead was to retaliate and smear and gaslight such an accomplished researcher, thinking that they would not face consequences, or that the consequences would not be enough to dissuade them from doing something that they think will be better for the business. When Dr. Jabru came forward about what had happened to her, April Curley also came forward about the ways that she had been mistreated by many colleagues who treated her in a really horrible way because she was a Black woman, constantly twisted Google's processes to disadvantage students from historically Black colleges, and to undermine the work that she was doing to improve that area. And this is another area that some people may not see as linked to ethical AI, but for me, was an important part of coming to Google. Was I've seen the way that Google recruiters have mistreated even students from IIT. And when I worked at another company, Mimmer, I worked with historically Black colleges. And I also gained an understanding of the ways that Google disadvantaged or mistreated students from there. And so I had hoped that coming to Google would be a way to improve on those things. And so while I was at Google as a software engineer, I spent a lot of time volunteering on efforts to mentor students, to help with support calls for students that were interviewing, to push people in Google to change harmful interviewing practices. And many of the programs I volunteered with were created by April. And in September of last year, we were told that April was going on leave because of work-related stress, which was understandable because a lot of us knew how much opposition she faced to try and improve this climate at Google. But in December, after hearing what happened to Dr. Jabru, April came forward and explained that she had been fired and that she had been basically given an order to not talk about how it happened, and to add more voice, she decided to come forward at great personal risk to herself. When one point here is that lots of people at Google who care a lot about ethical technology and diversity, equity, and inclusion at the company saw all of this happen and more or less did nothing. Like many of us signed petitions, many of us communicated our concern to people in our management tree, many of us volunteered or worked with other causes. But sometimes there's a belief from an organization, especially like Google, that prides itself on being a good actor in technology, that when these things happen, they're aberrations. And since there's so few people that have come forward, that it might not be a deeper problem. It's just individual teams or situations that went wrong. But I have observed internally that it's not the case. That even though that there's a small number of people in total that have come forward, it's because there's great personal risk to them coming forward, and that these aren't aberrations, that there are deeper problems and challenges at companies like Google that we can talk about. This is not the first time that something like this has happened at Google. Actually, between the time that I accepted my offer to work at Google and when I started, Google retaliated against Meredith Whitaker and Claire Stapleton, two Google employees who had led a lot of activism about the sexual harassment of women at the company, about Google's involvement with Project Maven, a project to use facial recognition to differentiate between terrorists and bystanders in drones, and Project Dragonfly, an effort to bring Google's search engine to China. because of their activism on these issues, they were pushed out in a number of different ways that ultimately led to them leaving Google. Stopping short of firing them, what Google would do is reassign them to a manager that's less supportive, move them to a team that's outside of their area of expertise, and give them bad performance evaluations, even when they had a long track record of performing really well. It's a tactic that basically makes life hell for those people so that they'll choose to leave on their own. It was because I saw this happen before I joined Google that made me worried that maybe I was making a bad decision. And so I wrote down a series of moral red lines, like my own individual things that I don't want to do or be part of doing. And if my work at Google Shopping or Google crossed those lines, then I'd have to take some kind of corrective action. Not necessarily quit, but to work with my manager or my teammates to address it. Most of those red lines were related to Google Shopping because that's where I was going to join. And I'm happy to share about those if you're interested. But one was a red line for me is retaliation against a teammate who stands up for something that I believe in. And my frame of reference for that retaliation was what Google had done to Meredith Whittaker and Claire Stapleton. When this, but then something like that happened again while I was working at Google. When I was at Google in November, there was something that you can read about in the news called the Thanksgiving Four, a group of 4 Google engineers who were fired, and the National Labor Relations Board later found that 2 of those workers who filed complaints about how they were terminated were unlawfully terminated. That probably did cross my red line, and at that time I didn't leave. It was really hard for me to get information at that time about why they were fired and what made it unlawful. And a lot of the information that I got from my own manager and from the leaders of the company convinced me that the firing was a good thing. And now I'm no longer convinced of that. But then when this happened to Dr. Jabru and to April, I was able to get a lot of information. And the information that I had access to is very similar to the information that's publicly available. The only difference is having some more context of having worked at Google for a year and a half and having more knowledge about like the culture and how decisions are made. And because of that, I knew that I was definitely past my red line. I tried to do some things to correct for that, like signing the petition, communicating to my manager, suggesting things that the organization could do to reverse the harm that was done. But it was clear immediately that the organization had no interest in doing those things. And so I felt that the best thing for me to do was to start my job search, find a new job, and then leave Google. I did it that way so that I could sort of protect myself, right? So that I could find a new role and go and leave at that point. And that's more than even I think a lot of students and early career people will be able to do. I was very fortunate that I had lots of friends and even professors from IIT that were supportive of me through that very stressful time, and that I was able to find a new job so that I could quit. Quitting can also be a selfish thing because I'm saying that I no longer want to be part of this organization, which means I'm giving up a chance to internally help and fight against it. And that's a debate that you'll hear about in some of these other conversations. But in this case, it was clear to me that there was minimal impact that I could have internally and much more impact that I could have by leaving and by sending a clear message to my team that this is inappropriate behavior by the company, and it means that I can no longer work at that company. So hopefully that gives an overview of what happened and how I approached that tough decision. Before I go on to other stories, I want to pause here if you have questions about this specific one.
Could you talk about like your ethical red lines specifically for like Google Shopping? Because I know that there's like some ethical considerations for like that part of Google.
Yeah, definitely. So I wrote down 3 ethical red lines about Google Shopping and one more about Google more broadly, which was the retaliation against the teammates. But the three red lines that I wrote for Google Shopping were, one, a red line would be misinforming users or consumers in order to benefit merchants, sellers, or Google. A second red line was greed by Google, defined as trying to optimize for revenue or engagement or some other metric at the cost of things that would be good to consumers or merchants. And the third was preferential treatment for large merchants and sellers over small merchants. And I think in retrospect, those were three good red lines to choose, because those were core and central debates that we had in a lot of my work with Google Shopping. Google has harmed a lot of companies and consumers in all three of those areas, but I'm not sure if it crossed my red lines in those areas. And it was a much more uphill battle because there's an entire leadership team of executives, project managers, and other senior engineers who believe strongly that Google is doing the right thing and that their strategy has made the right choice. And so for me to come into that organization and to not have been an expert in e-commerce before, I'm getting a lot of my information from a pretty biased source, which is Google. And Google has multiple legal challenges, both in the US and abroad, over antitrust regulation, which specifically centers on some of these questions. And so there's a lot of people that are researching and trying to understand, like, is Google acting in the wrong way in those areas? I have one more example that's from Google Shopping that I'll talk about next, that sort of challenged my red lines, that didn't fit into what I had already planned about. But those three came up a lot, especially when COVID started. One of the projects that I worked on was something called query level policy enforcement, which is we block certain features from triggering on queries that are likely to contain abusive or harassing behavior. And so we generated a list of queries for products that had been having a high level of scam merchants. Think of stuff like toilet paper or face masks. There were lots of sellers popping up and selling counterfeit goods, selling nothing, doing lots of things to scam consumers. And so I implemented the logic that would block shopping features from triggering when a user on google.com searches for these like high risk features. And to me, that was an example of Google Shopping actually taking responsibility. We talked about ethical responsibility, which is Google could be getting views and engagement and even sales in this area that puts the customer at risk, but it's going to spend the engineering time and spend the resources, because it's not free. You also need to have human experts that are going and reviewing these merchant accounts and these queries to actually find the patterns. We have algorithms that are designed to do that, but those algorithms are built on top of the human labor that does it. It's not a trivial cost for Google to work on taking responsibility for that issue, but in that case, the team felt it was our responsibility. And conversely, there's also ethical discussions on the opposite side, which is it paternalistic or even censoring for Google to filter certain types of search results? Or is the technology that we build to block queries for COVID at risk of being used for other types of projects that are not ethical? And so we had those discussions and we settled what we're doing in this use case is good. It's meeting our responsibility. We'll ensure that it's not abused. And we've built restrictions around our technology so that if other teams at Google try to use it for other things, then they won't be able to until they get the approval and have some of those discussions. Stanley asked a question. You mentioned Google recruiters mistreating IIT students. Could you elaborate on that? I think one of the most common is just a lot of Google recruiters underestimate the skills of IIT students. When recruiters at companies decide where they're going to hire like interns or students from, they have to decide which schools they want to engage with. And continuously, Google recruiters send efforts to IIT, which is good. But because there's a number of IIT alumni, those IIT alumni are the ones that are coming to the school. And then for other schools like Northwestern or U Chicago, Google pours in way more resources trying to recruit from there. And it's not just IIT, but Google also generally overlooks the great community colleges and city colleges that are in the city of Chicago that are producing very talented computer scientists. And then when students from our school and other schools get interviews with Google, they're stressful coding interview challenges that some good computer scientists are effective at, but others who are talented programmers and computer scientists are not, because of anxiety, or because it's not realistic to the environment that they'd actually be coding in, because they don't have the tools and support that they normally use. And the best Google can say is, sorry, you didn't pass the interview, try again in a year and a half. And this is amplified even more in the situation of historically Black colleges and April Curley's work, because you have students who pass the coding interview, they get to an on-site interview, they pass the technical interviews that are there, and then at the end of all of this, where it's like this person was strong in algorithms, this person worked under pressure, this person knew how to do these algorithms without having tools or support, then there's a culture interview. And in that culture interview, an engineer is asked to rate the candidate based on how googly they are, which is things like their leadership potential, their communication, and how they approach solving problems. And so often, April noticed that students that scored really well technically across all those bars then got a bad rating for the culture fit. And that is one of the ways that that students that aren't from the like traditional Silicon Valley background are disadvantaged. And it's a huge component of discussions of racial equity because of how it plays out with historically Black colleges. But that same problem also disadvantages students from IIT. There are lots of brilliant IIT students that have proven that they can pass Google's challenges, but then somebody who doesn't know them, who hasn't seen their involvement on campus or their work in research and hackathons and in their community, thinks, you know, I'm not sure if this person has high leadership potential, or maybe they struggle to communicate, or they're not googly. And that can blow up the process. And then beyond that, there are worse situations where a recruiter will say something to a student that is either borderline or outright racist or sexist. And it is incredibly disrespectful and harmful to candidates and to the culture of the company to do things like that. And it is part of why people like April have worked so hard and fought so hard to change those processes, to change the company. And instead of being rewarded for working on those processes, she gets gaslit and punished and moved around and given bad performance evaluations. And the takeaway from that is that Google, it cares more about having a sense of like civility between those teams and the people that work on recruiting than it does addressing the needs of marginalized candidates. And that Asami makes a good point, which is like that involves most companies. And that is a piece of toxicity that's like in the technology industry. If there are things that you can do at your organization after you've graduated to address those, you should, because it's not okay. It's not something that we have normally, and that's why people like April should be rewarded for their work, not punished. Does anyone else have follow-up questions?
Somi has a follow-up question. She asked that isn't what most companies are like though?
Yeah, I think most companies are that way, which doesn't make it okay. And that's why we should take actions to address it. And that's something that I heard all the time when I worked at Google. Was my teammates who had been at Google much longer would say, yeah, Google is doing bad things in these areas and it's bad in these cases, but it's better here than it is elsewhere. Simon also asked, as an entry-level employee / interns, how can we make a difference? I can skip to my last slide, which is about this. It's important to acknowledge that, like, as students, interns, or early career hires, we have a lot less power than senior engineers or managers or executives do. But something that I observed at Google is that, like, a lot of people that have less power or privilege are doing more earlier and louder to address these problems. And so if you feel like the first piece is, like, if you feel safe to take action, you can. If you're in a situation where you think taking an action to address what you see as an ethical problem might cause you to lose your job, put you in a bad position, or put you in harm's way, there shouldn't be an expectation that you act. And if you know someone who is in that situation, that's a chance that you can support them and act in a place where they can't act. So the first 3 bullet points are like small things that feel small, but I want to communicate to you that are not, that can make a big impact. And then the next 3 are things that are, like, maybe more substantial. So the first one is to speak up or to speak through others. And I'll give an example of what I mean, speak through others. What I mean is that there's 2 ways to do this. One is, if you know someone else who's already speaking up, you can simply amplify what they're saying. If you're in a meeting with your manager or a senior member of your team who doesn't manage you but is that you work with, you can tell them, hey, there's this other person who is talking about something that I think is really important. Will you check out this blog article they wrote, or this video, or will you sign this petition or do this thing that they asked? Another way to speak through others is to ask, if your manager is someone who is supportive of you and claims to be supportive, then you can ask them, hey, this problem is really important to me. What would you recommend I do about it? Or can you mention this to your manager? Or is there something that you can do about this? And you can also tell them, you're like, I don't want to bring this up more broadly because I'm worried that people will treat me differently if I talk about this. As soon as you say something like that, you can kind of, like, catch your manager off guard. They understand at that point that you're being vulnerable with them. And if they don't, you can, if you're worried that they won't, you can specifically ask them, like, can I be vulnerable for you at the moment and talk to you about something that is important to me that I'm looking for your help on? But it seems that very few people have a manager that is actually willing to do that. So that may not always be an option. And if your manager claims that they are willing to do something like that, then it's your choice whether you want to sort of test their commitment to that. The second thing is always about education, learning about risks and remedies. I'll provide some resources at the end that you can read more. It's helpful. One problem that's sort of underscored by the firing of Dr. Jibru is how Google is upset at people who point out problems. And maybe you've heard this at different companies, which is like, bring me solutions, not problems. But even this is not actually sound business practice. A good executive or a good team should want to know what the risks and problems are ahead of time, because once it becomes too late to address them, it becomes much more costly and there's a greater risk of failure. And so just highlighting problems and understanding why things are risks or problems is itself a type of technical work, not just providing the solutions. But then the step that is traditionally valued is the remedies, which is, what are other organizations that have this kind of problem doing? Or what could we sacrifice or give up to make sure that this risk is mitigated? And then rephrasing those as proactive or responsive actions that the organization can take. And the third is volunteering your efforts. If you have the time and the bandwidth, both in work, and I'm going to talk specifically about in work, is, I don't mean volunteer your outside of work time. I mean, when you're assigned a project, you take the time to write, like, a document about what are the risks and what remedies would you recommend. or you take the time to do a data analysis of something that you think is a problem to quantify or qualify how big of a problem it is. And if you have an ally on your team, which is like a senior person or somebody else who is respected within the organization, you can ask them to help you defend that work that you did was valuable and that work is technical. And since you're the person doing the work, often you'll be in a situation where the work won't get done unless you do it. And so it's your opportunity then to inject the ethical due process that might be missing. And that is one piece. Like there's a discussion or a debate that always goes around, which is like, oh well, if I think that my company is working on something unethical and I refuse to work on it, they'll just find someone else. That is a discussion that is sometimes true and works in debates about ethics, but in practice, it often comes down to you. That if you don't work on it, it won't get done. And if the company has to find somebody else to do the work, it will be delayed and they won't. And it would be more effective for them to hear the results of your work and work with you on those pieces. And it's also a common way to defend why a project is taking longer, because you identified problems that weren't known before. And the same way that if we find a customer or user requirement that wasn't known before, or we find a market or legal risk that wasn't known before, if we find an ethical risk that wasn't known before, that merits slowing down and taking time to address it. And usually those are squashed implicitly, where the team thinks we don't want to slow down for something like this, and they choose not to stop. If it has to be stopped explicitly, where the manager says, I want you to not work on this, or I don't care about this risk, that is a much different thing. And that's a much harder thing for your manager or your team member to say. If they still say that, there are other resources to help you, but often they'll stop short of doing that. And they'll defer to you, the person that's actually doing the work, about the ethical risk. Some of the harder things that not everyone will have bandwidth to do are to write your moral red lines. And like I said before, if your red line is crossed, it doesn't mean you have to quit, because that's frankly not an option for a lot of people. But knowing where those red lines is important, because otherwise people at your company or what you read can convince you retroactively, sort of like a confirmation bias, that what's going on is okay, or that there's nothing that can be done. If you have the red line, it's a way to push yourself to find what is something I can do, even if it feels like a small thing. The second thing is to support other students and coworkers. It's likely that, like I said, a lot of these things are not aberrations. They're far more common than what we might hear. And so if you know someone who trusts you, maybe they're a friend from school or they're someone you've known from working with at the company a long time, think about or ask them directly how you can support them. I've seen people do lots of things like extending from even as much as helping someone financially to something that feels smaller but is still important, which is just to speak up for them in meetings or other pieces. But those are ways to help other people that might be limited or worried about an issue that matters to them. And then the last, which was the debate that we were talking about, which is if you think that there's some project that should not be done, that there's nothing that can be done to address it, you can deny your skills to working on it. And that doesn't mean you'll never build it, but that's one piece of leverage that as technology people we have, is we can say we won't build this, or we won't build it until these conditions for it to be built safely and ethically are met. And if you don't exercise that muscle, it sort of starts to go away. It's a very hard thing to do, especially when you're earlier in your career. And there are ways to do it without being seen as disruptive. But if you continue to exercise that muscle and to work in teams that exercise that muscle, there will be more opportunities to do that. Samya, what's missing from that answer that would be helpful to you and to other students? Cool. Any other questions about anything we've talked about? So I think we're almost at time. So I actually, I as usual talked too long on those stories and didn't cover some of the other pieces. But I'll leave you with these resources. One was I put together a link of like reading materials or videos that you can watch that cover one, how can you learn more about the current state of ethics and technology? Two, what are actions that you can take as someone who's a student earlier in your career? And then three, if you need help with your job search, whether you're looking for a job in tech or whether you're trying to change from a company or a workplace that isn't safe, what resources can you use? So I think Prince and the ATM will send those out afterwards. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me on LinkedIn or at my Hawk email, which I still check regularly. And if anyone else has any questions, I'm happy to stay on for a bit and answer.
Yeah, we'll be seeing these resources, and also a recording of this video, because I know a lot of people had to leave early for like class and stuff. But yeah, if anyone has any questions for Vinesh.
What do you think about like the new Alphabet Workers Union?
Yeah. So I'm sort of sad that I didn't hear about the Alphabet Workers Union until after I decided to leave. So the Alphabet Workers Union has been in in the works for a long time. Like it's preceded by many years of Googlers doing activism, and that was part of why I wanted to come to Google in the first place. Was I saw that Google employees banded together and got Google to pull out of Project Maven, which was a project that I thought was unethical in any shape or form. That was a project that wanted to use computer vision to tell the difference between who was a non-combatant and who was a combatant in a military conflict. And the consensus from researchers was that that's not something you can tell from a picture. And regardless of whether the AI can be debiased or improved or made safe, that's just not an appropriate that's not an appropriate decision to defer to a technical solution. It's even a difficult it's even a difficult decision for humans to make. It's the kind of thing that comes up in war tribunals. And the the way that uh, Google employees unraveled the financial and political entanglements of Google's involvement in that project, used their collective power to push the company to pull out of it, and supported each other even when Google executives retaliated against the people that were publicly part of that, was really inspiring to me. And I think that has been the one successful way that Google workers have improved the ethics of the company. There's lots of people that are quietly having these conversations, like I talked about, where it's you try to push your teammates or your manager privately to stop a project, but that has its limits, especially if the team doesn't want to cooperate. And so the Alphabet Workers Union, a lot of my friends and former colleagues actually decided to join AWU after I left, and talking to me about like what things at Google I thought were wrong and dissatisfied. I think in the reason that I left, which is about how April and Dr. Jabru were mistreated, that's an area that's been tough for the Alphabet Workers Union as well. I think they'll be successful in the future as far as getting getting Google to improve some processes, but the trust is completely broken, and Google continues to not follow the recommendations of Dr. Jabru's team or the Alphabet Workers Union in how they're handling the reorganization of the ethical AI team after firing Dr. Gebru and now firing Margaret Mitchell, the other co-lead. So in a short-term view, I feel that I can have more impact by going and working somewhere else. But it's necessary for people to participate in efforts like the AWU, and there's a lot of good examples of the work that they're doing. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I appreciate all of you joining for what I know is a really difficult and at times frustrating conversation. Please check out these resources and shoot me an email or a message on LinkedIn if you have more questions or if there's anything that I can do to help you out personally. Thanks a lot, everyone, and take care.
Thanks so much, Vinesh.